Hey, welcome everybody. I hope this actually works. It should. I've already tested it on the Great Debate Community channel, but I'm going to be doing it on my main channel this time. So we are in Discord. The link is to join in is in the video description. However, I put two links in there. I don't know which one works. Pick one. If it doesn't work, try the other one. I know SJ used one of them that worked, so I know people can join. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking to SJ Thomason about deontology, objective morality, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff, because that's been a popular, well, it's something that you like talking about. It's been popular with you, right? And so I was like kind of watching her feeds, and I don't know, I had some questions on it. So hopefully maybe this particular hangout, I get to ask SJ some questions about her positions. And I got Cheshire's in here right now. I've given the link to Nicholas Suter. And well, this is, like I said, anybody come in that's not a troll, welcome to come on in and have a discussion with us. So we got about 180 people on the Discord right now. Quite a lot, actually. So come on in. But SJ, how you been? It's been a while.
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
I was on your channel, what, like last month? Been about a month?
It's been a little while, but you've been on my channel a couple times.
Yeah, so it's about time you come onto mine, right? Turnabout's fair
play. Yep, exactly. No, so I'm really happy to be on here, and this is the first time I've talked to Chesh in person, and I found out that she's not really 17.
Shocker, right?
No, I always thought she was a very sophisticated 17-year-old.
Let's not go crazy. Cheshire sophisticated. That's not a term you hear often. No. Josh, are you sophisticated? Do you drink wine like out of a fancy glass and like with your pinky for tea?
With your pinky sticking up?
She's not.
No, I like drinking wine. Wine is delicious. I prefer red wines. I like Cabernets usually. Sometimes I'll take a Merlot. They're pretty good as well. As for fancy glasses, I mean, it kind of just depends on where I am. If there's a fancy glass available, sure. If there isn't a fancy glass available, I'll drink out of the bottle.
I like Cabernet Sauvignon. I like a Pinot Grigio. I like. I actually I had a pink wine the other day. It was like a blush. It was. I don't remember the exact name, but it was delicious. It was really good, I gotta admit. But I was my birthday drink, right? My wine. But right now I'm just drinking coffee. A lot of coffee today, so hopefully that we'll be able to get through this topic, because this is as I was talking to Chess earlier, this is a topic that's it's very laden with terminology. And it kind of sucks because I like the discussion when it comes to these types of things, when it comes to ethics, but trying to get through the terminology is almost like walking a minefield. And I think that a lot of people use these terms differently. I'm not accusing SJ of doing that, but I'm just saying that when people have a conversation and I see them talking to SJ or she's talking to somebody, whether it be on Twitter or be on her channel, there seems to be a little disconnect on the terminology that they're using and position. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to be talking to SJ and hopefully maybe kind of get her stance on some of this stuff. And it's not a game of gotcha, but it's just trying to narrow down her position. Because I see this. I'm just going to throw it out there, SJ. What I see a lot of you doing is you switch between deontic and archaic type belief systems, or ethical systems. And what that means is basically a deontology, as you know, because I read your blog, it goes to duty, right? Moral duties and responsibilities. And a more of an archaic type system is more towards virtues and honor and things of that nature. So I see kind of go back and forth when you have these discussions. So maybe can you just kind of tell us where exactly do you stand on the ethical moral landscape? I mean, do you consider yourself a deontologist, a consequentialist, utilitarianist, virtue ethicist, agent virtue, patient-centered virtue ethics? There's a wide diversification of these things, and I'm just kind of to narrow you down where you stand on it. And I read your blog, so I think I know, but I don't want to misattribute these things to you.
If I had to pick, if I had to pick between, say, deontology and utilitarianism, I would say I'm a deontologist. But I can see taking both views. I don't like the way that academics like to pose a false dichotomy by using the trolley dilemma with these two things. So I like the way that if you consider both views when you're trying to make ethical decisions. So these fall within the normative ethical framework. And like you mentioned, virtue ethics also falls in there. I don't focus as much on virtue ethics, but I definitely like to talk about it. I'll definitely talk about moral character and all that kind of good stuff, and Aristotle and his ideas on sort of the Goldilocks principle of virtue ethics. So I'll definitely talk to that.
Yeah, no, and I do agree with you. I don't think you have to be locked down at a very specific one. I don't think like a person has to be, I only subscribe to this ethical theory. Like a Kantian would generally say that they're going to subscribe strictly to a deontological categorical imperative, right? They're not going to waver
Right.
from that. So I don't fall into that. I think that you can appeal to different things. Even if you're a consequentialist, I think that there are times where you could say, well, look, I'm going to appeal to some other theory, right? I think there's some flexibility there. Although in specific types of frameworks, there is very limited type of flexibility. Even with virtue ethics, there's different types of virtue ethics where you're a little bit more locked in to position than some other ones. One of which would be, I believe, is called what is it called? Trying to think of the name of it. I'll think of it later on. But you had mentioned something like the trolley problem. So first, people are asking who you are. Tell them who you are, because you are an academic. You have a PhD, not in philosophy, but you are an educated person. And just to, like, give you your background real quick. Then we're getting into like the trolley and some other problems, because I think that these kind of do narrow down a person's overall ethical framework pretty decently, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So my name is SJ Thomason. Somebody asked in the chat if I have a YouTube channel, and I do. And Chester just posted a link to it. So feel free to come on over. I've been on YouTube for a couple of years. I've been on Twitter since about 2014, and I met Steve on Twitter. And I am an academic. I teach business management, primarily leadership and human resource management, business communication, and cross-cultural psychology to people at a university that's in Florida. So I'm at an accredited university in Florida, and it's really nice out this time of year. So that's what I'll say.
Okay. Yeah, that works. All right. So, okay. So reading your blog, and again, I know you cite a lot of stuff, and I'm not against citations, right? Of course, but those aren't really telling me anything about your actual arguments. So from what I can understand, you argue that if there's any kind of objective morality or any kind of ethical based system, for us to even be in a normative case, not even a meta-ethical case, but just a normative case, that we have to eventually make all our morality grounded in some kind of deity that is giving these laws prescriptively, right? Is that correct?
Right. I would say if we have moral prescriptions, and if we feel like these moral prescriptions are universal, and we over time humans have come to discover them, if that's possible, if that's the case, then I would say that there has to be a grounding or a source, and to me the source is God.
Okay. So to you, the ethical, okay, let's make it really simple for the people listening. An ethical action, what we consider to be a moral ethical action, is the action we would take normatively given an ethical dilemma. And as a deontologist, you would argue that the ethical thing to do is what is in line with the law or the duty. So if God commands something, let's say God says X is a permissible action, or God, more specifically, God says X is not a permissible action, it's impermissible. A deontological approach would be the mere act of violating that was something would be immoral, was something be immoral. But the adherence to that rule, right? If I say, hey, I adhere to this moral commandment from God, therefore I am making an ethical decision that is right, merely because I am obeying the law. It has nothing to do with the consequences. It has nothing to do with the benefits to society or to the masses, like utilitarian, or to virtue. It is the mere fact that you're obeying God's commandment to you as a deontological or deontologist is what makes it ethical, right? Was that what you were saying?
Well, I don't look at it quite that way. So I see what you're doing. You're looking at it as here's how I would look at it. Let me phrase it. I'm looking at the idea of having moral values and moral duties. And moral values talk about what's good and bad. Moral duties focus on what's right and wrong. And if I looked at the moral values, I would just say, okay, well, we have these values that we've discovered, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, as the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence says. So all men are created equally. That just basically means that we're all equal in the eyes of God. In other words, that we're all made in the image of God. So all humans have value. And that's really important. So we value life, we value freedom and liberty, and we value justice, we value truth. And so we all have these ideas of moral values, and then we have moral duties to do what's right for others. And so we have these moral values and duties. And so when we're making decisions about what to do, we have the duty to follow these values of life, liberty, justice, and those sorts of things.
Okay, but that's the issue I have, because it seems to me you're switching between deontic theory and archaic theory. Because if you start talking about virtue, because you're saying we should do this because they're virtuous things to do, is basically what you're implying. They're honorable. They promote Enamoia, they promote well-being, they promote happiness, promote love. These are the terms I've heard you use before. Those are not what we consider to be, or I would consider to be deontological. The mere fact that you're obeying God's commandment is the highest ethical good at that point. For an actual deontologist, that's saying, okay, let's say like the divine command theory. Divine command theory would be the prescription that God commands something. If you act in accordance to that commandment, you are being ethical. Right? Even though it is, I consider to be ethical subjectivism, because God basically, to me, if he said these are the prescriptive rules, I don't know why he prescribed them. I don't know if there was just because it was a whim, if he was just arbitrary in describing them or prescribing them, or if there's some higher value to behold him to be beholden to, actually, I should say, that he has to prescribe it, which means it's something higher than God, actually. I mean, right? He's saying, I have to make this a moral law because there's a reason higher than me I have to make this a moral law. Or you just said, hey, I made this a moral law because I wanted to, which is pretty arbitrary, right? So, but do you agree that the ethical action would be obeying God?
I think, see, that's not the way. I don't do it that way. So I would say it's the ethical system is grounded in God's nature. And then I would say, well, how do we know what God's nature is? How do we know what God wants us to do? And I would say we could look to Jesus Christ to see how God wants us to act. So we look at this idea of bearing our own cross, helping others, sometimes even giving up our lives for others. So that's our model. So the whole idea of God's commands, God's not commanding me to do anything. His mere thing was love your neighbors as each other and love the Lord. And
but that sounds like paragon virtue. That's okay. There's something called agent-centered virtue ethics. Okay. And agent-centered virtue ethics, one category of that is called paragon ethics. Paragon ethics is basically what would Jesus do kind of thing. You're propping up Jesus to be this role model, this archetype of perfect ethical consideration, assuming that he lived his life without making any moral mistakes, right? I mean, which, by the way, we have 30 years of Jesus, but we know nothing about him, right? But you're assuming that he has made no immoral actions, or he's done nothing to be considered to be unethical, correct?
That's a Christian position. Yes, okay. Absolutely.
That's virtue ethics, though. That's not deontological. That's what's called archaic.
Deontological is just saying that we're going to we have a duty to do what's right. That's the bottom line with deontological. It's real simple. But you're right. We can certainly look at. No, I think that we can certainly look at what would be a good moral character if you want to speak on virtue ethics a little more.
Well, the reason I'm trying to narrow it down is because what makes something good, right? We'll call the good. We'll call it the good, right? The good is what the collective of things. Let's say there's a universal amount of things that we should do that are morally permissible, right? We're going to call that the good. And when we say, what is the correct moral action we have? I have a decision to make, right? And I need to know normatively what moral action I should take. Is it more moral to have the duty to do it, right, and therefore follow that? And I say it is the act itself. It is the action of following the law that is moral, which is a deontic theory, or is it moral because I have virtue to do it because Jesus was a virtue person and Jesus was this? He's my paragon. What's called patient-centered agent-centered virtue ethics. He's my role model. Therefore, I am being ethical because it's what he did, not because of the law. Those are two different ways of looking at ethics. So if you have a moral choice, which one to you is the reason why you choose A over B, for example? If A is the law, and you say, okay, I am obeying A because this is the rule that God has commanded, or is it B because there's some virtue to be had to emulate this paragon of virtue that you've had in Jesus? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what would be a good way to explain this, because I think if we were to, I'm trying to think of a dilemma that I've had in my life kind of recently. Let me think of something, because I could say, what did I follow? How did I follow? How to answer it? And if you ever have a dilemma, a lot of times you might use a bunch of different ideas instead of just saying, I'm going to focus on either the virtuous action, or I'm going to focus on trying to emulate Jesus, or I'm going to focus on having this specific duty, or I'm going to focus on what the greatest good is for the greatest number of people. So I think you just sort of look at a lot of different perspectives and put them together in your mind. And that found, if you want to go back to Kantian deontology, he talks a lot about reasoning and how what we want to do is he says that deontology is grounded in a way in reason, and this idea that you want to reason your way through your decisions. And you could probably draw from a lot of these different perspectives.
Yeah, no, and I don't have a problem with drawing out different perspectives. What I would like to know though is what makes something the good. What makes something an ethical, permissible act, right? Because as agents of moral consideration, we have all these decisions to make, right? And if I had to say, look, I want to know what is moral. I want to know what is the right thing to do. And there's, as you said, there's a many different things you can appeal to. You can appeal to, simple things like consequentialism. You can appeal to agent-centered virtue ethics, or what's called patient-centered virtue ethics. You could say these are the reasons why I think these are moral acts, and then people could attack them, saying, "Well, what about this and what about that?" But what do you think has a higher, maybe a moral duty? Do you think it is more moral to obey the word of God, or to appeal to something along the lines of, like I said, like a agency of Jesus being a paragon? Do you want to emulate him as your moral standard, or do you want to obey God? Which one do you think is a higher moral act, or do you think they're just indistinguishable from each other?
Well, let's put a specific. I just thought of a couple of really good cases that we could apply this, and then we can figure out how we would do it. And so if I say, and this is an old example that a lot of people have used, but if I say that I were hiding some Jewish people in my basement during World War II, okay, and Kant would say that we have to follow the truth no matter what. And so Kant would actually say you are not allowed to lie to the Nazi SS that show up and want to and ask you if you've got people hiding in your basement. So according to Kant, just following his duty, that to me would be flawed.
Correct.
So
that's why I think Kantian ethics, nobody really follows that any longer, right?
You can't follow just like I would never look at truth inside of a silo and say that I can't pay any attention to what else is going on. So what I would do in that particular case is I would say, okay, all right, well, Kant would say that I have to tell the truth. However, I want to save these people's lives. So I would value the value of life over the value of truth.
Which is consequentialism.
Yeah, and it could be consequentialism also, saying that I want to, in this particular case, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I want to help the 10 Jewish people hiding in my basement.
Okay, but
and so,
but yeah, and I agree with you. I don't accept Kantian ethics, the categorical imperative that he thinks. I mean, I get there are certain things that I think he can make a categorical imperative for based upon the golden rule of vice, like having to be biblically motivated. But when it comes to like you shall never lie kind of thing, like that is a categorical thing for Kant. Never lie. I don't accept that. I don't think it's ethical to never lie. I think there's times to be it's necessary as a virtue ethicist to say, okay, there are permissible times to lie. For example, if somebody's dying on their deathbed, right? I mean, and you want to comfort them. I think it's permissible to lie to them to aid them in comfort. I don't have a problem with that personally, right? But I know some people that are like, oh, I'm just gonna, hey, look, you're dying, but you know what? There is no heaven, there is no hell. You're screwed. I don't find that to be morally just, right? I don't particularly think that you always have to tell the brute fact or brute truth. I think there's a happy middle ground, as you would know, like Aristotelian virtue ethics would be the middle ground between brute honesty and dishonesty, right? Or just lying. So, or deceptively lying, right? To harm somebody, right? But you're moving from deontology to consequentialism now. By the way, they're both deontic, but
well, that's the thing. Sometimes you would, the thing is, in my view, depending on the situation, you have to figure out which ethical framework or just which ethical decision makes the most sense. And so you say, do you value the truth more than you value people's lives, or do you value people's lives more than you value the truth? Well, I would say if I have to bend the truth to save someone's life, I'm going to have to do that.
But what if God said no?
Can I pop in real quick?
Please.
It sounds to me like what SJ is describing is that depending on the situation, you can vary which ethical framework you may be following at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of like a particularism type approach, a moral particularism. Right, there's context to be had.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what it's
no. I think that's kind of what she's saying, which is to me moral particularism. But okay, how about this? Let me try working it this way, SJ. If God said, this is my commandment. Thou shalt not do this, whatever. And I don't want to get into specifics, but thou shalt not do this, right? Whatever that rule is. But you have a situation where you say, hey, look, if I do this, these many lives will be saved, right? And this would be going to consequentialism, or more specifically, even utilitarianism, which is the benefit of society, right? The most amount of people, right? So if you say, look, I need to violate God's law in order to save more people, which action would you take? Do you think it's more ethical to obey God, or do you think it's more ethical to put your own view on this and say, oh, okay, I'm going to appeal to consequentialism or utilitarianism, vice
I would
deontology of
absolutely
God.
follow God's law, and I need to tell you why, though.
Sure.
So, okay, so I would say if I'm doing something and I decide that, hey, I'm going to be able to save 10 people, so I'm going to make this decision, even though God told me not to do that. Okay, so I'm going to violate what He told me to do, and using my own human fallible perspective, because the difference with God and me, obviously there's a big difference, is He's omniscient. He can see concurrently in the past, present, and future. And so He can see the potential of any actions taken today and how that would influence the masses down in the future. So I would assume that the 10 people in the big scheme of things it's not going to, for the greater good of society down the road over the next 1,000 years. If God said that I'm not supposed to do that, I would have to take His word for it, because He's got the better perspective.
And you do admit you are assuming you know His will, right? You do assume perfect communication between you and Him, that you are doing what He's asked of you, or not doing what He's asked of you, in the case may be, right? He's telling you what's morally permissible. You're assuming that is the mind of God that it is coming from, right? Because I don't see any way. This is where moral epistemology comes in. I don't see any way you can access that information objectively to know that is the rule of God.
I wouldn't. Well, here's the other thing is, there's only one time in my life I feel like I actually heard the audible voice of God. I heard it once in my life, and it was basically telling me not to do something that I was thinking about doing. So guess what? I'm not going to do that. And so I think it's a really good thing that He spoke with me, because it's actually probably saved my life. So,
yeah, of course, people could say that we all have our internal voices, right?
This particular case was one time I'm pretty old, and I one time in my life heard something. And
I believe. By the way, I believe you've heard something. I've heard audible voices as well, and I'm not talking about schizophrenia. I'm talking about what's called hypnagogic hallucinations. These are type of hypnagogic or audible hallucinations. People will be into like a lucid state. We all, I think, will admit we probably have heard things or seen things that years ago probably would have taken as a vision or a voice, rather than just the fact that our brains are working in overdrive, right? Especially if you're kind of in an REM type brain state and you're kind of conscious, these things tend to happen. But if God Himself, let's say you did have perfect communication. Let's say this is what God wants, right? So God says this is an impermissible act. So that would be something that is categorical, right? There is no way to ever violate that. It is always going to be the ethical thing to do, and this is deontology. Always going to be the ethical thing to do to obey God. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I would. Yes, I agree that whatever He says, I would go with. That's a Christian. I mean, that's just not. I'm not the only Christian who thinks that way. I would think that any Christian who reads the Bible and listens to the words that are in the Bible, we would have to probably say, okay, if God says something, I have to take His word for it.
Okay, and let's just say it's not continual revelation. Let's say it's like from the back of the day, right? Because you're reading the Bible, I think, and you're getting a lot of your moral grounding from what you read from that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and I'm not trying to take it tangentially, but obviously, like when it comes to Levitical laws, the 613 mitzvah, those laws at one time, even though I don't think they were kind of asserted to be the case, but at one time, would you have said that God did command those things? Like simple, like this, eating shellfish. Do you think God commanded that one time?
Yes, I do, actually.
Okay. But he changed his mind on that?
Oh, it's not that He changed His mind. The culture changed. So He's adjusted His the laws that He gave us. He initially gave us Mosaic law, and then Jesus fulfilled Mosaic law, and so now we're into the new covenant. And so Christians today have never followed this Mosaic law. So we never were told we couldn't eat shellfish. So I consider that a non issue, because in Acts 10 it made it really specific that that portion of the law was no longer something that we needed to follow.
All right, but if it's categorical, okay, so if God said right now don't eat shellfish, you would have to obey that as a deontologist.
If I saw some writing in the sky that said "Do not eat shellfish," Stephanie Thomason, okay. I'm not going to eat shellfish.
Okay. So why did God give that commandment then?
Why did He give that? Well, here's what my Jewish friends have said, and I know it. Haven't I heard that you were part Jewish?
Well, my mom's Jewish, yeah. I don't know if you can be part. I don't know. Can you be part Jewish? Either you're Jewish or you're not Jewish. I don't know if you can be part.
Well, that's true. So if your mom's Jewish, then you would technically be Jewish, right?
Yes. in the culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you probably understand it better than I do, but I've spoken with a couple of my Jewish friends from school, and I asked them how this all works with food. I said, why did God say, for example, some of them still follow this idea that they're not allowed to eat meat with cheese, and they have certain rules like that, and they follow the rules today. And I said to him, I said, why did God make it so specific with diet back then? And their perspectives were because God was trying to separate the Jewish people from everybody else. And so he wanted the Jewish people to follow him and his covenants, and he kept them separate. So when he had them eat very specific food, a lot of times that would keep them eating with each other and not going and mixing with the pagans who were eating pigs and other food like that. And so that was, at least that's my Jewish friends' perspective.
But here's the problem I have with that. When we're talking about moral permissible acts, right? When we say it is impermissible, when we're looking for a moral decision to be made, and I say, look, it is impermissible to eat shellfish. And the reason why God has commanded it, right? That would be a deontological approach, right? It is the duty to God. The act of adhering to that law is what makes it ethical, right? So if I violate that law, I have done something that's impermissible, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how it affects anything. The mere act of violating God's law is impermissible. And adherence to it is what is permissible. So if God said, don't eat shellfish, for him to do that without some kind of reasoning behind it as far as what makes it morally incorrect, not so much the like you say with the tribes, but what makes it morally impermissible, there has to be some value higher than God for him to make that decision. Even if you go by his reasoning, right? Even if he wants to do this or that, he has something of value that has made that directive, don't eat shellfish, to be non-arbitrary, that he thinks is a higher value, which is the good, which is the ethical thing. He thinks is ethical, right? He thinks it's ethical not to eat shellfish. He thinks it's unethical to eat shellfish during that time. Would you agree with that?
And you want me to give you my guess on why,
Sure.
with the whole overall big picture? So I say to myself, I say, why did God have these specific rules? Like, for example, Jewish people are also not allowed to get tattoos, and Jewish people were also told that they had to cut their hair a certain way, and they had to wear certain kind of clothes, and everything was really specifically laid out for them. And there were one of the biggest things with him is sexual immorality. So he had a lot of laws concerning that kind of stuff. And what he was doing is he basically identified a group of people. He singled them out, and he decided that he was going to work through them to bring his son to the planet. And so he basically set them apart from everybody else. They had their set of morals, which were different than other people's. And so that also drew attention to them. And he worked through them. And so suddenly Jesus appears. And as predicted in the Bible, from the Bible in a number of different places. But so Jesus appears and he fulfilled Mosaic law. So now those laws are no longer applicable to us. And he set apart these just two laws. He actually also fulfilled the Sabbath. So this idea of following the Sabbath and worshiping we worship on the Sabbath, but we're not supposed to necessarily rest on the Sabbath because Jesus himself represents the Sabbath. So of the 9 of the 10 Commandments, we still pay attention to 9 of them, but we don't necessarily need to follow the Sabbath because it's not mentioned when Jesus said, summarize the 10 laws into 2 laws, or the 9 laws, I should say, into 2 laws. Love the neighbor, love the Lord above all else, and love the neighbors as yourself.
But isn't that utilitarianism? So, I mean, he's trying to do what's the best good rather than just saying, this is obey me. This is my law. Therefore, it is morally impermissible to break this law. That's the way a divine command theorist would work, right? If he says this is the way it is, you violate it, you've done something immoral. But in this case, it's not that you're not doing something immoral because he's commanded it. You're doing something immoral because it has affected utilitarianism, that there's been something to the greater good that has been diminished, right, for his greater plan. And by the way, with the Sunday thing, if I can ask you, okay, so let's say the God commands you not to work on Sunday, right? Don't work on the Sabbath. Do you think that, by the way, that's still a commandment?
Oh, that's what I'm just trying to say. Jesus actually fulfilled that.
Okay.
So
well, let's just say that you did assume that. Let's say that, because there are people that still think that, right? There's
some
Christians.
do.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some Christians who won't work on the Sabbath.
Right.
And there's some Jewish people who don't work on the Sabbath too, but they're still following the Old Testament.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, again, really confusing because now you have 2 Christians that are saying, "Hey, we want to obey God's law," but here we're saying that this rule no longer applies, and they were saying that the other group says it does apply, which is really confusing, right? But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yes, it can be. I mean, it's a shame that we have so many different perspectives on the Bible. And that is something that is troubling to some people. And I think that a lot of people, if you want to find the answer to your questions with respect to the Bible, you pretty much go to the Bible. And it sounds funny, but that's the best advice, instead of trying to veer outside of the Bible and come up with these, your own rules. That's one of the reasons why the Jews had so many problems, is because they have the Old Testament, but then they have their own rules and laws and things that go way beyond that. So it makes it really hard for anyone to follow what they believe in. And that's why Jesus sort of scorned the Pharisees and said, come on, man, you guys have created so many rules that no one can even follow them anymore.
All right. Well, like I said, let me ask you this. I'm going to use Cheshire as an example. Let's say Cheshire does believe that God commanded you don't work on the Sabbath, or you don't work on Sunday. Now, she obeys that law, and she says, I'm not going to work on Sunday because God has commanded it. Okay, that is ethical. Right? Let's say somebody asked her, hey, I need to do this. And she says, you know what? I can't do this because God has commanded me not to do it. That would be a morally ethical act according to divine man theory or deontology specifically. But let's say Cheshire did believe that God commanded that. But you know what? She doesn't work on Sundays because she's just a lazy piece of crap. She doesn't really care so much about the duty to God. She just doesn't like working on Sundays because she's lazy. How is that now ethical? Right? Does that make that's the kind of problem I have with divine command theory, when you're saying, or to God, just saying, okay, what makes it a moral act? Is it a moral act because I'm disobeying? I'm actually obeying God, that I'm not working on a Sunday? Because if somebody says, you know what, I'm just lazy, I don't want to work on a Sunday. God commanded it, so it works, but I have chosen not to work on Sunday because I just don't want to work on Sunday. Those are the same consequences, right? The Chester's not working on Sunday, but she's applying two different standards of reasoning, right? One of them I find virtuous under deontology, if you want to subscribe yourself to that. But the other one under virtue ethics is not virtuous. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, and I think you're speaking to something that's really important here, because you're mentioning what people's intentions are.
Motivation is a big thing, by the way, with me.
Intentions are to do something good and it turns out bad, but you really wanted to do something good. Well, then I think that you were trying to do the ethical thing. And I think that's more ethical than somebody who's just sitting around eating bonbons all day.
Oh, I agree with you. But this is funny. This is why you talk about deontology. But again, there's defeaters for this. So anybody who watches this later on is going to be like, well, there's arguments to be had about this. But if there's something called motivation, agent-centered theory, ever heard of that? An agent-centered theory is a virtue type of ethics that, given a moral decision, is going to be moral if somebody had good motivation for it, if somebody had good intentions for it, right? Even though there's problems with that, because obviously the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So a defeater to that is, oh, well, hey, Cheshire had really good motivation, but it ended up being a bad decision, right? It was an unethical decision. But to somebody who's saying, well, you know what, the virtue thing to do was to be motivated, right? I wanted to help out. I wanted to do something nice, even though the consequences were crap. Is it a virtue act in virtue ethics because she was motivated to do something good, right? I think there's something to be said for that. I think motivation, even though it may not result in good actions, I think that is virtuous to try to do things. There's actually different levels in that too. You get into perfectionism versus what's called minimalism. Like how many virtues do you have to hit in order to be considered to do a morally correct action, right? Do I have this perfectionist approach where I have to make sure that I am being virtuous at all virtues, or do I just need a minimal amount, right?
That's actually, you're speaking to something I want to hit on. Hold on one second.
This is one of the things I like about virtue ethics. It's like, where would you stand in this, right?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I want to give an example. So say I'm driving my car and I pull up and there's a guy sitting on the side of the road asking for money. Mm-hmm. And he's wearing a sign and it says, God bless you, or something like that. And I honestly do see that sometimes. And I'm sure you do too, because you're in California. Yeah. And so you see that and you look in your wallet and you say, do I have anything I can give this guy? And so you give him $1 or a couple bucks or whatever it is. And then, unbeknownst to you, he goes off into a liquor store and buys himself some beer. And so your act that you thought was kind, your intentions were positive, but of course then he went off and he went and bought himself some beer, and it didn't turn out to be a good outcome for him, because maybe he got drunk and then all of a sudden he walked out in front of a car and died. And so now you contributed to this guy's death. So how are we going to handle that? So the idea is, our acts one of the things about Christianity, in most of the variations of Christianity, except for Catholicism, is that we focus more on faith over acts. So a lot of it's based on our intentions and our faith. And our actions will never measure up. So it's not, we can't just have a minimal, hey, if I do 5, well, in Catholicism, when I would sin and I'd go talk to the priest and I'd profess my sins, he would say, okay, go do, say 6 Hail Marys and 10 Our Fathers, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, no, I think there's a happy middle ground.
Question?
There's actually a middle ground to that. What's it called? It's called permissivism. So like, if you wanted to like divide virtue ethics into like 3 categories, you would have perfectionism, which is like, you have to hit every virtue, right? Which I think would be more of a paragon thing. Like Jesus would be perfectionism, right? Permissivism is you have to hit a certain amount, right? You just got to go, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? And so you're giving money to a homeless person. You're, being altruistic. You're being kind. You're being something that you could strive to be virtuous. And then the minimalists would say, hey, you know what? As long as you are adhering to one particular virtue, your action is considered to be a morally permissible act, right? So there's different degrees you can have in virtue ethics, where you want it to lie. But I think, to me, I more would maybe fall into permissivism, that if if you have some motivation to do something good and you hit a lot of these virtues and you say, look, I have given this guy money, he used it for something else, but my act in and of itself was to be kind, right? His act, right, was to take that money and use it for something that probably wouldn't have been what it was designed for, but it, maybe is making him happy, right? Even it led to a consequentialist action of him running in front of a car and getting killed. That's not on me. My moral act did not make him do something that led to his something wrong in his life, right? That's how I kind of look at it that way. I'm not held responsible for what their decisions are. But yeah, Chesh, go ahead.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind me jumping. And it's just that it seems to me like, particularly on Sunday, in what way is this a moral issue? Just the act of working or not working on a Sunday. And I think that would kind of get to the crux of what the difference in what you guys are talking about. If there's outside influences to working on Sunday or not, like the consequences of not going to work versus going to work and the motivations to or to not, sure, but the act of going to work or not is not on particularly on a Sunday, is not necessarily a moral action.
Right, exactly. Bingo.
Right, and I would say that the Sunday working thing is not really a moral issue today for most people. There are some parts in Christianity who do that, and then there are, of course, some parts of Jewish people.
Well, it is if God commanded it.
Well, then you run into an issue of why
so
would
for a
it
Jewish
ever
person,
have been?
Because for a Jewish person, also why would have not eating shellfish been considered the moral action? And so these were all part of the Mosaic law. Because it just depends on what your belief system is. And in my belief system, the Sunday issue isn't an issue. But what are some moral things in Christianity that are issues that I would say that maybe don't seem like issues? And a lot of them have to do with just doing what you can. You're basically supposed to have a foundation of faith, and then your works are supposed to come out of that. And so they say you'll know them by their works, because your works are coming out of your faith. But if it's, we don't have the rules with respect to the food eating and things like that anymore. So we just have to look at the kinds of things that God would consider nice. And that has to do with being good to other people.
Okay.
But doesn't that cause a problem if you're looking at it as if following the law of God is what you should be following? Do you not run into an issue then? I'm not trying to harp on you. I'm actually understand.
Oh, I don't see you running into so what am I supposed to follow? I've got 2 commands I'm supposed to follow, and I mentioned them before. So that's it. So I love the Lord, and then love your neighbors. And so anything that you do that's consistent with that is good in the eyes of God.
Yeah, I don't think you could make a whole moral framework.
So long as your intentions are the way they need to be.
Okay,
no, because
but you can't make a whole moral framework off that. You can't.
I think you could.
No possible way. I mean, if you say, "Hey, God said don't steal," right? Stealing is bad. Stealing is impermissible. However, as people that need food, right? Families that need food, people might steal in order to survive, right? Which is against God's law. Right.
Oh, see, here's what it plays out in. So there's the values that are, okay, we have to look at a hierarchy of values, for example. So for example, to us, the highest value possible is the value of life. and the value of everyone's life. So in the old days, have you read the book Dominion, by the way, by Tom Holland?
I don't read. No, I'm kidding. No, I don't read.
Okay,
Spider-Man wrote a book.
He's an agnostic. He's really, it's a really impressive book. And so what he did is he basically traced Christianity and what its influence has been. And he went back to the time of the Roman Empire. And he said that during the Roman Empire, people did not value other people. If you were wealthy, you were valued. If you were a soldier, you were valued. You were given hospital care and you were given an education in these positions. If you were female, you're considered a second-class citizen. If you were a baby female, a lot of times you were left out to basically rot because you weren't valued at all. And so the baby females a lot of times were left out to rot. And then once Christians came around, they started collecting the babies, and they started bringing them into hospitals and caring for people, and they opened up schools for everyone. And so because they had this idea that we're not going to say that one person's life is more valuable than another. And that's why they were at the forefront of getting rid of slavery in those times. Obviously, they had to bring it back.
That's actually a deal.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I don't understand what that has to do with my question.
Well,
My question was about if something was never a moral action to begin with, and it being part of the law, therefore following it is moral, why would it either apply then or no longer apply now when it wasn't a moral act to begin with?
See, here's what I'm trying to tell you that you have to look at the big picture here. And so the very big picture and the very big message that's woven throughout the entire Bible is this idea that all humans are made in the image of God. So that's it's said in the book of Genesis, and it's pretty much pointed out. Jesus figured out the way to exemplify that. So if we say, if everybody is of value, if all humans are of value, then that must mean that our most important value, if we're trying to figure out what's a right action and what's a wrong action, is the value of life.
Okay.
But my question, that is completely ignoring my question. But
I don't think you see what I'm saying.
Law, I understand what you're saying, but my question was, you have something that is not moral and not immoral. You have an action that is neither as part of your laws.
It's neutral.
By saying it is morally good to follow a law because it's a law, why are actions that are not moral or immoral even part of it to begin with?
I know exactly what you're saying.
I'm not sure.
I don't think you're understanding here, SJ. Let me try to explain.
Well, no. I think I do, but
okay.
let me ask Chester. Give me an example of this action that's still applicable today to Christians.
It doesn't matter whether it's applicable today.
No, it does matter.
Like I said, it doesn't. No, and it doesn't matter because
any law.
It doesn't matter because a good example is just working on Sunday. Cotton or whatever, shellfish. It doesn't matter. The point is that it was something that is not a moral action or an immoral action is being placed as a law, and therefore and if you follow the actions of whatever law you're following is the moral thing to do because it's the law.
Right.
Then you're running into a problem where you're taking an immoral action and placing morality onto it.
Yes, you're taking a morally neutral thing that has no really of consequence to anything, right? I mean, eating shellfish.
You guys are giving me something that isn't even one of my laws. I eat shellfish and I work on Sunday. So
right. But it doesn't really matter what the law is.
It really does, because she's trying to say that there's some law that's around now that's neither moral nor immoral, and I'm supposedly following it, but actually I'm not following it. So I
didn't say what you did or did not follow.
But assume that there is.
But it's not a law.
But SJ, assume there is.
Why should I assume that we have a law that we don't?
But listen.
I'm not saying you do.
Yeah. Let's say there's a morally.
We don't have that law.
Hang on, SJ. Let's say there's a morally inert law, right? That does exist, that God has commanded it. Okay. For whatever reason, God's able to do that because he's God. So he's created a law that really has no consequence to us whatsoever. But the mere fact that he's commanded it is something as you would have to obey, right? And then he could change that later on. He could just say, well, you know what? It's no longer something that you need to worry about because it is morally neutral. That to me is not what ethics is about. Ethics is right. We want to know what is a morally good thing to do. And if you're just saying, hey, this is something that is morally neutral, but God has commanded it, therefore it has some kind of higher moral good, that doesn't seem to me to be a well-placed moral framework. Is that kind of what you're saying, Chuck?
No, that's what I'm trying to tell you guys is is a Christian today who believes what I believe about the Bible and what Jesus specifically told us to follow, which did not include the Sabbath. if a Christian today is trying to figure out what to do, we look to a hierarchy of values when we're making a decision. So, for example, when Steve Brent mentioned stealing, he said, "Well, what happens if I have to steal because I have to provide food for my family?" Well, you put your family on the pedestal higher up on the totem pole than the value of value of
the God commandments, right?
Here, I'll give you an example of something that a lot of churches do. They sell things in their church, and they use their platforms to sell things. That happens a lot. It happens in small churches, it happens in large churches, sometimes it happens really large scale, sometimes it happens by, like, the church puts up a coffee shop inside the foyer of the church. Now, Jesus was not okay with shit like that. So that might be a law that Jesus would follow that Christians are not following. Is that a fair example? Does that make more sense to you?
Plenty of examples over the centuries of Christians who haven't done the right thing.
But this is
You're
the whole
dodging
point.
the question.
That's the whole point. What is the right thing to do, right? We are trying to discover.
Obviously, no. It's not to be selling stuff inside of your church. My church doesn't sell anything inside the church. I've never heard of doing that.
But they think.
I believe that some people probably are. I'm sure at Joel Osteen's church you can buy a lot.
The point is that it's not necessarily immoral.
Right.
By the law. That's the point of the question.
Right. Exactly.
I think, like what we mentioned a little bit earlier, I think a lot of it has to do with what your intentions are. And so what are they using that money for?
Oh, okay, but SJ, this is where I kind of like lose my mind, because if you can't say, look, my ethics are based upon God. The grounding for God is everything. I have to obey God. And then say, well, you know what? We're just actually going to put it to love and these other virtue type things, right? One of them has to have a higher moral goodness to you, right? And because you basically move from deontology to kind of a virtue type thing, like to more of a archaic type system. And this is where I get confused, because as somebody who believes in God, your position should be, has nothing to do with love, has nothing to do with well-being, has nothing to do with treating yourself, treating other people like you would treat yourself or anything like that. Is the fact that God has commanded you to do it, period. That's it. Nothing else matters to a deontologist. It's not the consequences. It's not the virtues. It is the fact that you're obeying God's commandment. And Chess brilliantly pointed out, there are morally neutral things that God has commanded that people do for whatever reason. Now, is that unethical to do so? For example, the selling of merchandise in the house of worship, is that morally impermissible?
I think you have to look at the situation in their hearts.
That's
Steve.
not an answer.
I'm trying to say.
It doesn't matter what their hearts is. It's either morally permissible or not.
You're being very dogmatic. Why? Why are you being so dogmatic?
It's not being dogmatic. That's logic. Either it's morally permissible. Well, hang on. It's not dogmatism. It's either an action is.
You're not letting me. No, you're not letting me answer the question. You're instead saying I have to take one position or the other, when I have to be able to say that you have to look at the situation.
Well, hang on.
I can't make one.
Okay, Chesh, wait 1 second.
No.
But SJ, do you realize it is either the case it is a morally permissible action, or it is not the case that is a morally permissible action? There's no possibilities other than that. That is classical logic, right? So you do have to pick one.
No, I would have to look at the church and see what they were selling and what they were doing. Like, I would actually want to go into the church and see exactly what's going on.
But now you're appealing to consequentialism and other things.
No.
Well, here, let me explain.
Steve, and so what if I am? I'm just saying I would want to look at the situation. In fact,
I actually agree with SJ.
Okay, go ahead, Chess.
I agree.
Inside the church.
Yeah, I agree with SJ. I think it would matter to whether or not it's actually good for the church or not. The consequences are important. However, that's where, SJ, I think you might be running into a little bit of a problem, because earlier you were saying that the law of God is what is important.
Yes.
And that's what makes things moral or immoral.
Exactly.
Therefore, their reasoning, for whatever reason, even if they do think it's good for the church, would be against God's plans because it's against his laws.
Exactly.
And therefore would be immoral and inadmissible, no matter what their reasoning would be.
Exactly.
I think what you're adding in there is the no matter what their reasoning would be. And I think that God would look at their hearts and he would see what the situation was. And so I'm not going to immediately throw down the axe on all the churches if they're doing that. I would want to go into the church and find out what exactly are they doing? What are they selling? Like, when you say that people are selling stuff in a church, what is it? Because in my church,
I
I've
gave the
never
example
seen
of
anybody
coffee.
sell anything.
I gave the example
Selling
of coffee.
coffee?
It's almost like
Yeah.
moral
See, our church
relativism at
gives
that
out
point,
coffee.
though. It's almost like, hey, we're going to judge each church whether they're doing something morally
So, are you
permissible or not
telling
based upon
me-
relativism.
Now,
I just want
let
to
me
make sure
say,
I
I'll
understand.
put the hammer
Let's
down.
take a positive example. Let's take a positive example. Let's say they're selling Bibles. They're selling Bibles.
Are you hitting your
in the
desk,
church.
Josh, while you're doing this? Sounds like
I'm
you're...
tapping it. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very loud.
Let's say they're selling Bibles in the church as a way to help provide Bibles to people to then go out and make the church a little bit more money so it can recoup its cost in the Bibles that they're selling. Okay? And let's say their goal is to spread the word of God, and the goal is to help improve the church. So everything is a positive thing towards the church. However, these people are going against the laws of Jesus and the laws of God by saying you do not sell things in the church because Jesus is going to get really mad, flip tables, and whip people. So does that mean that whatever they're selling is morally impermissible and would be considered a sin? Period.
Okay, I've just decided what I think on this. So I've given this some thought. And no one's really asked me about selling stuff in a church before. My church, as I mentioned before, does not sell anything inside the church. So I'm going to go ahead and put the hammer down and say that no, I do not think it's correct for a church to be selling anything within the walls of the church.
And why?
Because Jesus made that clear.
All right, so you're
So law. Yeah.
Yeah, your reasoning is because of a deontological deontological. God damn, I'm having too much coffee today. So because of deontology, you are saying that God has commanded this. It is morally impermissible to sell things based specifically because it's God's commandment. Or God's
I'm going to say that
or duty to
I would actually probably go back to the verse when Jesus referred to it as a den of thieves. And I would say that because Jesus referred to the money changers in the temple as people who were selling stuff rather than doing what they're supposed to be doing in the temple, which is worshiping and praising, I would say that yes, that's completely morally incorrect. And so now that I've considered your question, that's my answer.
What happens if they were selling things in the church where they're giving all that money to feed the homeless and shelter people?
I'm going to still say that that's wrong. I've just decided. I mean, sorry if I'm changing my opinion from what it just was a little while ago.
No, you're good.
I had to think this through, and I'm thinking through that. No, I don't think it's correct to sell anything inside the church walls.
Okay, so you're more adhering to deontology right now, which is a position that it has absolutely nothing to do with consequences, right? I mean, if you're a strict deontologist saying that God commanded this, that is the only reason why it's morally impermissible or permissible, is because God has said so. Period. Regardless of anything else. Right? It doesn't matter about anything else. It doesn't matter about motive. It doesn't matter about consequences. It doesn't matter about utilitarianism. What matters to a strict deontologist that subscribes to the type of command theory that I think you do is that God's rules, God's laws are immutable, and you cannot violate those. So the adherence to those things are ethical. The violation of those things are unethical. That's how you would describe what your moral framework would be from what I understand.
Oh, I've told you my moral framework draws from a number of frameworks, but in this particular case, after thinking it through, I think that it's wrong for people based on our moral duties of what Jesus exemplified.
So does that make it objective?
Does it make it objectively wrong? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So then is it objectively wrong?
Yeah, because we have a moral. So our moral standard is essentially, we could look to the example of Jesus as living out our standard. And so if Jesus did something like he went and turned tables in the temple because he was upset with these people, he's giving us a directive that this is the right thing to do.
But this is, again, you shifted from deontology to agent-centered virtue ethics by making him a paragon of virtue.
I told you that I also draw from a number of different perspectives.
I know, but
I'm not a
these are very competing theories here. It's like,
well, it's actually not competing.
Oh, they very much are.
Steve, it's not competing in this case because you're forgetting that Jesus is God.
Well,
so
no, that doesn't matter.
Anything
actually, that makes no difference.
No, and let me finish, because in this case, Jesus could not have done anything that would be against God's will or anything that would have been against God's law, and therefore anything that Jesus does is going to exemplify that law no matter what. So she's still following lawfulness, she's just personifying it in Jesus.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that, and let me tell you why. Because when we're looking about what's morally permissible, if you say it's morally permissible because Jesus is God and God has commanded it, that's deontology. If you say it's morally permissible because I am looking at Jesus as some paragon of virtue that I want to emulate, that's archaic theory, right? That's
right, but keep in mind
deontic.
that Jesus, part of the reason why Jesus even came to Earth in the first place was to put some kind of conduit so that people could even understand what God's rules and laws even were to begin with, because God is really hard to understand or some people would say impossible to understand for a human. So essentially Jesus is there so that way it makes it easier for someone to follow God's law, because now they have a paragon in which to view that law. So even though essentially, yeah, you're kind of bending the pathway onto paragon, you're still actually following the law either way. You're just kind of taking a detour to get there because that's the best way for some people to understand it.
Now it goes, yeah, but now, okay, but the problem I have with that is then it lends into consequentialism, right? The reasons why you do something.
Oh, sure.
The reasons why you do something is what we think is morally correct, right? So if my reasons why I do something is because God commanded it, that's completely 180 degrees opposite of saying I'm doing this as a moral thing because I have a paragon of virtue that I'm trying to emulate. Virtue ethics and deontology do not mix. They're completely
except
separate.
That on this case, the paragon that she's referring to is the God, because God.
But you're not
so.
doing it because he's commanded it. You're not doing it because of a duty or an obligation. You're doing it because you want to emulate him. That's virtue.
SJ, do you have a duty to emulate Jesus?
See, Steve, I think you're trying to force me into like a square peg into a hole. And I think that if you just, I mean, here's the deal. We draw from all of these different perspectives when we want to figure out what we're supposed to do. So the duty, yes, is to follow Jesus. And Jesus also is the paragon of virtue, if you want to call him that. So we're drawing from two different areas right there. And if that we figure that what we do is the greater is going to have a over the centuries by trying to emulate Jesus and by trying to be better people, that'll have a greater effect on a great number of people. Well, then that also is drawing from utilitarianism.
Yeah, I think somebody like myself would be able to draw from those things. But as somebody who believes in God, I don't see how you can draw from multiple sources. To me, if you're going to say God is the moral grounding, then anything else doesn't matter. There is no appealing to virtue ethics. There's no appealing to agent-centered moral theories. There's no appealing to utilitarianism. They are the only thing that matters to somebody who believes in God, that is the moral lawgiver, is that God created that moral law. That's it. There's nothing else they could ever appeal to. The way I look at it, to somebody who's a true deontological.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
Why?
I mean, of course. What
makes something moral is that God commanded it, right? That's what makes it moral.
No, that's not this whole. I think you're getting a little tied down with this divine command theory idea. I think if you just realize
God commanded it, certainly, right?
What we would do as a Christian is I say, I want to make the right decision. And if I'm trying to figure out how to make the right decision, I'm going to look for all kinds of different ways to make that decision. Now, is it in line with what Jesus did? Like I look at what would Jesus do, that little phrase, or you look at, am I going to be, is this and then I have a duty to follow Jesus. So I'm also looking at that. And I have a duty to try to do the greatest number of things for the greatest number of people in my life. And so all of these networks are impacted. All frameworks are impacted. We draw from all of them.
Like I said, I just find it to be confusing when you're drawing from all of them as somebody who believes that God is the ultimate authority.
Well, I definitely believe God. And I also believe that he, here's something we haven't talked about so much. I believe that we all have a conscience. And so I would say within our conscience, that's something that gives us evidence that we also have a person who gave us that conscience.
I don't think
that's a rabbit hole and a half. Before we jump down that one, which I'm fine to do, but just to kind of close off this point a little bit, I think most people would not view it as a moral issue whether or not you are or are not having coffee in a church, or selling coffee in a church, or selling Bibles in a church, or whatever. However, the Christian who goes by law would say that is immoral. It's an immoral action, but it's ascribing an immoral act, or it's ascribing morality to something that is otherwise benign.
If you think it's benign, I guess you have to you have to ask, I guess you could ask the question or reason with yourself on why Jesus did what he did. Why did he go inside the temple and start knocking down tables?
Oh,
Why
sure.
did he do
Yeah.
that?
No. Yeah. What I'm saying is
So,
find it, but Christian says that because of the law and because of Jesus, so therefore is a moral issue, but to something that would otherwise, without that law, wouldn't be a moral question.
Yeah, what
yeah,
happens to that? Let's say there was no moral laws from divine origin, right? Would your ethical framework change in any way? I mean, I happen to believe that morals come from the fact we are social creatures, that we are agents of moral consideration over long periods of evolution. And I think that's pretty well standard for a non-theist. Would you agree?
I'd agree that that's the position that atheists have for sure.
Yeah, or not a non-theist. I'm not an atheist, but a non-theist. I mean, it does,
Or,
I don't think morals come from
Jonathan
God.
Haidt.
Right.
Yeah, so
Okay.
so it'd be a Jonathan Haidt kind of perspective. So he thinks that, and people, I've read some different articles, and you probably saw it in my blog. But I also actually I don't know if I put that in the blog now that I think about it. But did I in that blog did I mention the idea that people had posited why groups of people came to worship God because they felt like they needed a source of external accountability?
You mean okay? So they
There's a
can't
theory.
because they wanted some kind of externalized understanding where morality came from rather than kind of internal. Because there are theories out there that these things are in what's called intrinsically virtuous things. There's something out there that called patient agent centered virtue, or it should be patient centered virtue, where all humans have innate is some kind of internal thing that they have certain rights to themselves, one of which is bodily autonomy. So this is what something for a doctor, for example. A doctor deals with deontology a lot because they have certain rules they can follow, right? They cannot violate a patient's rights to say, I'm going to harvest these organs from a patient. But by the way, I don't know if this is why it's called patient-centered theory, but this is actually holds to be the case here. But let's say you are a patient. A doctor cannot violate law by taking the organs from that person to save, a dozen people, which would be utilitarianism, right? Well, you're saving 12 people, but you're killing one because there's this innate thing that we have given people to have. You cannot violate the bodily autonomy.
It's bodily autonomy.
Right. That's called patient-centered virtue theory, if I remember correctly.
And I think that what does go on in other parts of the world is pretty sick. In India, for example, there's a lot of harvesting of people's bodies, even alive people. They rip these people open, take their kidneys out, and send them across the ocean. So there are examples of people doing horrible things in the world that relate to that kind of stuff.
Right, and I think that's unethical, right? I mean,
I completely agree with you. It's horrible.
Yeah,
it's totally.
I mean, I'll give an example. By the way, let me get some people in here that have just joined. I got to unmute them real quick. So this is open. Yeah, you can come on in. Let me give you a problem you may not have heard of before. I mean, I know you heard of the trolley problem, obviously, clearly, but there's something very similar, but it's a little bit different because it involves other people. But have you ever heard of Jim and the Cowboys or Jim and the Indians?
Oh,
okay. So it's very similar. So there's a story of Jim and the Indians where explorer goes and he finds this group of people. He finds this group of people that are a group of Indians that have been found by some kind of cowboy. And this cowboy wants to exert his dominion over these people. And what he did was he lined up 20 Indians. And when Jim finds them, the cowboy says to Jim, hey, I'm going to execute all these cowboys. However, if you execute one of them, we will make this into a monumental occasion and we will exonerate the other 19. Okay, I guess these Indians were dissidents or something like that. So they were trying to set an example. But he says, if you kill one of them, I'll set the other 19 free. Okay, so the utilitarianists would say killing one person for the person who stumbled into this situation would be kill one of them to save 19. That's generally how utilitarianism would work, right?
Right.
But a counter argument to that is that the virtue ethicist would say, look, you are violating that one person's autonomy. You are killing them when they have an innate right to live. By not taking any action, by not killing that one person, the cowboy may or may not kill all of them, right? He can actually change his mind. But his action to kill the other 19 or all 20 of them, or he could kill you too, could kill Jim for that matter, is not incumbent upon your morality. So the actual virtuous thing to do is not kill that one Indian, right? Say, no, I've taken a stand, I'm not killing the one Indian. And if the cowboy decides to kill all of them instead, that's an unethical behavior on that one person. So it's a little bit different than the trolley problem, because the trolley problem, you are making a decision, right? To either kill one person or five. By the way, there's 15 different variations, 20 different variations of the trolley problem. But the basic one is that you kill one person to save five, utilitarianism. But, well, I guess it'd be more consequentialism. But in this particular case, you're not actually just flipping a switch. You're actually taking the life of the person, right? You're actually killing this person, which to a patient-centered virtue ethicist would say, I cannot commit this action, right? I cannot kill this person because it is an unethical thing to do because I'm violating their bodily autonomy. To a deontologist like yourself, you should argue, I cannot kill this person because God has commanded me not to commit cold-blooded murder, right? If you think
that's bad, if you just look at the majority of religions, even ones, dead people have more rights than women do when they're alive. I mean,
it's
you don't need to go this far with example.
Yeah, to do some things with a dead body, yeah.
No, I think actually what you're mentioning, what you're mentioning is very similar to what the results in the studies have shown when they use the trolley dilemma, because it's very similar to the trolley dilemma. It's this idea, the deontologist basically will choose not to harm anybody, and they just sort of ignore the fact that 4 people might die, or 5 people might die, or 14 people might die. But the utilitarian person would always make the choice to let's kill the one, and so the rest of the people will benefit. And I don't think
the deontologist for the trolley problem matters, because the deontologist, there's no law against flipping the switch. They're not duty bound by anything.
Flipping the switch.
Right.
No, but that's what when they do these studies, and they first what they do is they'll figure out someone's levels of either deontology or utilitarianism. And interestingly, I just got approved for a study that I'm working on right now. I'm collecting data on that exact same thing, because I'm trying to find out what the personality traits are that are associated with these particular characteristics, if someone's a deontologist or they're utilitarian. Because the one study I saw shows that higher levels of psychopathy are associated with utilitarianism.
Are you talking about the 5-factor model? Option. Wait, are you talking about the 5-factor model of personality?
No. Okay. I actually, that's what I'm not collecting on the 5-factor model right now. I'm looking at what they call the dark triad. So there's psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And so I'm collecting on that, and I'm also collecting on the Schwartz virtues.
You're talking about the dark triad, right?
Values.
The dark triad is Machiavellianism, is psychopathy, and narcissism.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if I remember the 5-factor model of personality was what? Neuroticism, agreeableness.
It spells ocean, just to remember it.
Openness, conscientious, you
got it.
Extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
You got it.
Hey.
There's actually an
people always forget
answer to the cowboy option. You could kill yourself.
No, because God's law would be you can't commit suicide, right?
No, not if you're a deontologist. I'm saying that there was another option out of all of the options, because you said there was an option. You could,
nihilist.
Is there?
You can't kill the cowboy in the situation. There's if you try to kill the cowboy, then
you can't kill the if you can't kill the cowboy is the option. Killing yourself could still be an option.
But then he kills the 20 Indians, and then everybody dies.
Good. Then everybody dies, and the cowboy's all alone. One of those
everybody dies scenarios.
And nobody has to deal with this shit.
But see, here's the thing. These are why we try to formulate our moral frameworks of what we think is a moral, ethical decision. And I think it's just weird when somebody says, okay, God is the ultimate moral authority, but in this particular case, we're gonna try to appeal to some other thing like consequentialism or virtue ethics. I can get away with that maybe, right? Or somebody who doesn't have a strict theological approach to God, but I don't see how a Christian gets away with that. And maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just me, but I don't get it.
What we would do is we would say that God is the foundation of all of these sort of frameworks, and so he forms the foundation to our reasoning and to our intuitions. And so when we're looking at these different frameworks and we're trying to figure out what we should do in these, we try to figure out, okay, obviously God is the highest value and the source of all this information and the source of our lives. And now we have to say, well, okay, now what we do? We start reasoning. And that's what Kant talks about a lot, is about this idea of reasoning.
No, and I agree with that. I think as moral agents, I think our moral framework comes from the fact we are able to reason, and we are based upon the fact that we have empathy and compassion towards people. And I think that's why we actually have morals. I think if we didn't have things like empathy and we didn't care about our fellow man, if we were just automatons and we were just robots, morality would not exist, right? We would have no
or
need
if we're not,
for morality.
we weren't social.
Yeah, we are
weren't
social creatures. That is the whole reason why we have developed, why we want to know what is a morally permissible act. Because we know we don't want our own rights violated, right? We don't want somebody to harvest my organs to save 12 people. So we have empathy towards other people who are in similar situations. But again, if we did not have these things like compassion or empathy, then why would we have any kind of moral framework? Why would God even care about morality at that point? He wouldn't even have any laws because it wouldn't matter.
Well, that would also tie into why it also changes. That's why it evolves and why ethics change over time.
They do.
Because
I agree with you.
We're
Yes.
still learning. We aren't perfect yet.
I happen to 1,000% agree with you on that, Chesh. I think that we have learned morality over a period of several tens of thousands of years as being social creatures. And if it was something that God had said, look, if God said these are the rules, right? He should have given them right off the bat, right? It shouldn't take thousands of years to understand what we mean by morality, right? It shouldn't take thousands of years to say slavery is wrong. He should have been at the bat saying, look, this is a morally impermissible act, period. Slavery is bad. I think we have to discover these things. And I do think that in moral epistemology, these moral facts do exist. And I think they are something we can discover, but that's because we try to look for them and find out what we think is morally permissible and not what's not. And I think I think that those that have bypassed all that stuff, who no longer looking, they just say, hey, what's right or wrong is because God has commanded it, have hobbled themselves. And I'm not talking about you specifically, SJ, but generally speaking, have hobbled themselves because they don't have a well-defined ethical framework. And especially when somebody says, look, if it wasn't for God, I would be out doing this, this, and this. I'm like, then you are not a moral person. And again, I'm not talking about SJ. I'm talking about those Christians that said that to me.
A generalization.
Yeah, and it's really bothersome, right?
Well, it becomes the other half of my question. The other half of my question would be, we were talking about an act that would be morally inert. It's not moral. It's not immoral. But if you were to take that and shift it to either a moral action or to an immoral action, what happens then? If you take something that would be considered immoral, like, whipping and beating people, if that's considered immoral, does it become moral when God says so? Because your morals are being dictated by the law, right?
See, according to here's actually, again, I'll go back to that book on Dominion that I know you guys haven't read yet, but I really highly recommend everybody pick that up, because just looking at the value and I agree with you guys to the extent that, yes, we are discovering our values and we're getting better over time. And over the last 10,000 years, humans have certainly improved. We can go back to the reason I mentioned that book is because he outlines the way that the Roman Empire was, and the Greeks and people before. And he talks about how, and even with Aristotle, they always talked about women being of less value, slaves being of less value. People had no value in so many cases. And so now what we're seeing is this really awesome thing in the West, where we've built our legal systems and everything on the basic premise that all of us are equal, in the eyes of God, essentially. And all of us have rights to liberty, life, justice, freedom, all those kind of good things, and bodily stuff, just like you mentioned. And so we have that all. So that's something that we have gradually discovered, and it's probably only going to get better.
Yeah, but like I said, the discovery of that isn't because God has told us to it, right?
Yeah, it wasn't explicit.
Yeah.
He's if you go back, actually, even in that book,
why couldn't God have added that in the Bible explicitly when it was first?
Did with Jesus Christ. He did that. So when Jesus came into the picture, we see that kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. You just actually different problem, and in that case, you run into a problem of why did we have to discover and change some of those that would be morally inert or morally impermissible, and why do we still have to change them to this very day? Because there are still things that we do and don't do that Jesus would do or would not do, right? So like flipping tables in a church. Jesus whipped people in that story, but that's not how you would handle kicking somebody out of the church for selling something nowadays. You might still agree that it's not morally okay for you to be selling stuff in a church, but you wouldn't beat them.
He went in with a whip, but he didn't whip people. It doesn't say anywhere that he whipped people. He hit people with the whip. It does not say that.
But if he had, wouldn't it be moral if he was Jesus and
He went in there and
decision?
Jesus never harmed anybody. So he went into the church and he whipped a whip to get attention, but he didn't.
Is there such a
and he
thing
started.
as psychological harm?
Who am I talking to?
Oh, my name's Al.
That's Al. Al's cool.
Steve told me it was open.
Yeah, Al's
in
cool.
The chat, so.
Yeah. I'm trying. There's a couple of people I'm trying to figure out here, and I just got Discord.
Okay. No, I didn't. All of a sudden, I realized I'm not talking to Steve.
Al's cool. And then we got some super chats in a second here. Well, I do something real quick, so carry on.
No, I'm just trying to say that that's the bottom line. And so Steve and I started off talking a lot about morality and different types of morality and different frameworks, and it sort of gravitated into talking about God's moral law. We spent a lot of time on that. We talked about Christianity. So we've talked about some pretty good stuff.
I'm giving people a status here. So go ahead while you're doing that.
It just becomes really difficult when we face things like divine command theory, where we come up against these dilemmas that aren't explicitly explained, whether they are moral or immoral. And modern dilemmas, like, there's nothing in the Bible about problems with robots.
Like what problems with robots?
Like, or machines even. Imagine if you have to interpret a verse to explain why, if someone does something negligent in a factory and it kills someone, we have mechanisms that would punish that person, through it. But how could that be interpreted morally through the words of a God?
So it's just the idea of love your neighbors as yourselves and don't harm people, essentially. So if whatever the tool you're using, just because they didn't mention a specific tool, such as a machine, that doesn't mean that the original assertion is incorrect. You know what I'm saying? So just if the rule is not to harm others, and you're saying, well, now we have machines that we could use to harm others, it doesn't mean the rule is eliminated. It just means that there are different methods that people would use to harm each other.
But if someone hurts someone through negligence or laziness, does that pose a problem?
I think negligence, laziness themselves are huge problems. Yeah. And that's definitely outlined in the Bible and Proverbs.
All right.
So I have a lot of people in the chat.
Don't mind me. I'm checking the.
I don't know if I should even stay on here, but
I'll do the super chats real quick, if you would.
Super chats were James is tired for 199. Interesting conversation. Thank you. Helios 575 for 10 said we already have robots that help each other via machine learning, even when the stacked in favor of selfishness in the short term, but ultimately led to decline and vice versa. So essentially what Helios is saying, well, we've already programmed and demonstrated it in robots without imposing any kind of God figure in any way. If they're capable of doing that, why would we need a God otherwise?
So is he saying that, wait, let me just look at, I'm trying to find the question so I can see. Oh, wait, we already have robots learn to help each other. Oh, okay. Yeah. So is he trying to say that robots are moral machines?
No. He's saying that if robots don't need a God to view long-term benefit over short-term benefit, why do we?
I would never make the claim that people necessarily draw on God to make their reasoning, to use their reasoning. I believe that reasoning is from God, but some people, you can be moral as an atheist or an agnostic.
Right, but you see the problem
make
there,
moral
right?
decisions. So, no, I don't see the problem with that.
Okay, so what you said is that you think reasoning came from God. Those robots weren't given that, and they still have it.
I don't think robots are moral machines. You can program something to do something, but it's not because the robot has some intrinsic sense of reasoning and morality. Mm-hmm. It's the robot is acting out something that a human put into the robot.
Yeah, but
other animals have a sense of decency or fairness or morality?
I actually do. Yeah, I do think other animals have that. I definitely see it in my dog.
So, Steve, you were going to jump in?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, so the thing is with they weren't programmed with that. What they were programmed with was they have two options. This one is better in the long term. Will these two robots help each other for the long-term goal, even though the short-term reward is greater for the individual for the selfish decision? So that is not, there is no morality being imposed on them. There is no human reasoning being imposed on them. The robot then chooses option one or option two based on the consequences of those things and there's no moral, there is no additional reasoning going on here. But you also stepped back a minute ago with what you said. You had said that reasoning came from God. Then you said that, well, I don't think robots are moral, but they could still reason. So did reason come from God or not?
Oh, I don't think morals can reason. I'm sorry, robots can reason. I think robots are merely acting out what they've been programmed by humans to do.
Well, then how can they make a choice? If there's option one and option two, what have we programmed them to pick?
That's
Neither.
Whatever we program them to do as far as the choice.
They don't.
They're
programmed to, you're misunderstanding. They're programmed to make a choice. They're not programmed to choose one or the other.
So so they've got some programming, and if they're acting on it, they're probably going to be taking in the experiences that they have and making additional decisions based on that, based on the original programming text.
Okay, but okay. First, I have a lot. I gotta tell you, this would be a whole different hangout when it comes to the artificial intelligence and morality and what we instill, because we're going to be instilling with artificial intelligence with our versions of morality. That's not going to be coming from God, by the way. That's going to be coming from us, because they have no access to God, right? How would they even get any kind of more epistemology from accessing God when they're an artificial intelligence? That seems
there are
weird
actually
to
two
me,
answers to that. One is that they're getting God through proxy, through
proxy.
us, or God's all powerful, so if he really wanted to,
I guess so. I don't know how that would work though. But
yeah,
anyways,
I guess you could say that the framework of the universe is designed such that things that develop reason and interact with the universe are working through a process that the God imposed,
or working through processes, because that's just the way reality is, right? And we observe the universe and we say, look, this is the state of affairs of the universe. Because of that, we just to survive have developed some kind of moral framework. That's the way I view it.
I think that moral frameworks and the anthropic principle are like hand in hand. When
Absolutely.
you're a being that can access a reality and interact with it, you automatically form rules around it, or else you don't form rules and you collapse and die, or
or you just wouldn't be functional, right? I mean, you couldn't operate in reality if you didn't formulate some of these positions, and as a society you couldn't. And I think that's where morality comes from. Anyways, somebody dropped in here, Mr. Ozzy.
Good evening.
Wow, how are you, man?
I'm very well, thanks for the invite.
Awesome. What'd you like to add in?
Okay, well, I came late to the conversation, but I was leaving some comments in the live chat, hoping that SJ might see them, and I don't know if she did or not. Probably not. But SJ, I'm trying to sort of get clear on what your position is. I thought I've heard you say in the past on some of your own live streams and in other discussions that you're a deontologist, but from what you're saying now, it sounds like perhaps you're not. So can you just, like, a simple yes, no, you can clarify it however you wish, but would you self-identify as a deontologist? This isn't a trick question or trap.
Yeah, no, what I was trying to say is I draw from a lot of different frameworks. And so if I picked one that was probably one of the stronger frameworks, it's deontology over utilitarianism. So if I were picking between those two, I probably would make a deontological decision.
Okay, so there's a difficulty with the way you're talking about this here, and it's this, and I think it's because you have come to this terminology by way of moral psychology. You've been you've talked a lot about trolley problems tonight and on other occasions, and trolley problems, they are thought experiments, but psychologists studying moral psychology make an awful lot of use of them, and what trolley problems expose is that people have a lot of conflicting intuitions. You express the trolley problem one way, and people say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll just do the moral calculus. I'll just go by body count, and sure, I'll pull the lever. I'll sacrifice one person to save five or something like that, right?" And then you change the thought experiment slightly. make it a doctor in an ER or something like that. And suddenly everyone's intuitions about what they ought to do change. Even people who formerly said, yeah, I'd pull the lever, in this case say, no, you should never do that, right? And so the whole point of those trolley problems is they expose that people have conflicting and competing moral intuitions, depending on how you describe the situation or depending on the situation. People will avail themselves of what we call deontological intuitions versus consequentialist intuitions versus heretic intuitions and so forth, right? But philosophically, these terms are meant to be incompatible. So these are, I'm sure you know this, these are meta-ethical positions, right? So deontology, consequentialism, and virtue-based ethics, these are meta-ethical theories. These are sort of umbrella terms. And the whole point is that they're supposed to capture the meaning of moral talk, the meaning of morality. What do we mean when we say something is right and wrong, when we say something is permissible or impermissible? So for a deontologist, the meaning of rightness and wrongness is exhausted by the concept of duty and obligation. Whereas for a consequentialist, the concepts of right and wrong are not reducible to the concepts of duty and obligation. Rather, the concepts of duty and obligation are themselves just reducible to a consequentialist analysis, right? So the idea is you're trying to understand the meaning of these terms. And so it doesn't make sense to say I'm, 3/4 consequentialist and, 1/4 deontologist and, whatever, because these are supposed to be mutually exclusive and incompatible analyses of the meanings of the terms. Now, no one denies that people operate with conflicting intuitions. And so as a description of your moral psychology, it's perfectly okay to say, well, I tend to operate more according to what a deontologist would say, as opposed to what a consequentialist would say, or vice versa. But it doesn't make sense to say that you are a deontologist or anything like that, because a deontologist is someone who says, listen, if what makes something right and wrong is reducible, or the meaning of that is exhausted by the concept of duty and obligation, and in your case, perhaps the concept of obedience to God's edicts, then that's all there is to it, right? And it doesn't make sense to say of God, well, he's a consequentialist. He's got reasons for what he does. He might have reasons, but if the reasons are consequentialist, it means that your moral analysis is ultimately consequentialist. Right? So does that make sense? So the idea is that these meta-ethical terms are supposed to capture the meaning of these terms. They're supposed to be reductive analyses of what the meaning of moral talk is.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make, by the way. maybe
I
I took the long way to get there, but he summed it up exactly what I was trying to say.
Can I help out maybe with an example that SJ asked me for earlier? Because she rejected the Jesus whipping one. What about the fig tree? Christians don't protest fig trees.
What's the moral claim in connection with the fig tree? I didn't realize there was one.
What are you asking?
Exactly, there isn't one, but Jesus cursed fig trees for not having that one fig tree because it didn't have figs when he wanted figs. So that's an action that, it's an action that Jesus is taking. But Christians don't. Nobody cares about fig trees.
Yeah.
No, he only cursed that fig tree. He didn't curse all fig trees, didn't he? Just curse that.
Well, that's where you could have a debate. You could have a debate about whether it could be all or just that one fig tree. I would agree with that.
But is it okay? But are you asking? What are you asking about the cursing of the fig tree, though? Is that something that was?
Well, SJ wasn't going. I said something that would be more wrong or not ambiguous, like neither morally acceptable. To some people, harming a tree is morally unacceptable because you're harming a living thing. Arguably, that is God's creation, right? So you don't see Christians going, and Jesus got mad at fig trees and said, "May you never bear fruit," but you don't see Christians out protesting the planting or farming of figs.
It's because what we do is we watch all I mean, if you read the Bible and you read the parables and you read all the stuff that Jesus did, we try to glean messages on what his bigger meaning is and bigger purpose. And there was no bigger message, I don't think, associated with the fig tree. I think the bigger message was associated in the temple of we don't want a den of thieves inside of a temple.
Well, I
So
think the
you're
bigger
saying that one
message
doesn't
would be
count?
things that are.
I just don't think there's.
No, I just don't see a
prescription.
significant message.
Yeah, I don't.
out of that
That's
one.
where I'm confused, Jess. What is the moral prescriptive rule that is being determined here? I mean, because God cursed the fig tree, but he's not going around saying you have to go curse fig trees, right? He's not prescribing any moral duty.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right, but he's
But
also
I
not
wanna go back to-
prescribing people
to,
kick other people out of the church for selling things either. That wasn't prescribed. That was just something did. Cursing the fig tree is also just something Jesus did. So if we're following Jesus's moral obligate, like he's a moral paragon, as if his actions are deciding what the laws are, then would it not follow that there would be a moral issue with figs?
See, I would look at exactly why would he curse the fig tree? It was probably obviously he would have. I mean, it's kind of sending a message that the fig tree wasn't. If we want to look at it, what the overall sort of parables that have to do with things such as trees and bushes and that kind of thing in the New Testament, I would say the fact that the fig tree wasn't bearing fruit can kind of be a metaphor for the fact of some people who don't bear fruit, and those people who don't bear fruit end up withering and dying. And the bearing fruit is the whole bottom line message as far as Christianity and what Christians are supposed to do. We're supposed to bear fruit as we come into Christ.
That's what I was going to get at, that if someone followed that example and, translated that as a metaphor to people, couldn't you argue that other people would start cursing people who aren't being productive rather than helping them?
I think it's the idea. I mean, the only thing that I can think it relates to is just the idea of bearing fruit. And that's mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament as far as people bearing fruit for God, essentially.
That doesn't
And so, yes,
people.
So
Yeah.
what's that?
Are people who are barren, should they be cursed?
No, it's not about bearing babies, that kind of fruit.
No,
the fruit is a
no.
metaphor for doing good works for God.
Yeah, they should know
Right,
by the
so for
work, your
people
works
who
that-
aren't-
good work.
Where does
I
that
can
put
see it in
people
multiple
who
ways as a
aren't-
metaphor.
Yeah, so where does that put people and how Christians treat people who are not bearing fruit for God is what the question is.
Yeah, because babies
Well, we're
aren't
told we're
literally
supposed to treat everybody kindly. So
Unless you're cursing them because they're fig trees.
Because
Well,
they're not having good. They're not
it's
doing
safe-
good. Go ahead, Ozzy. What?
It's safe to say that Jesus is presented as a singular kind of figure. He's supposed to be God, or at least the Son of God, or the Messiah, or depends on how your Christology is. But and he's supposed to be in a special position. He has these magical powers. He can curse trees, and other people can't. There's nothing there to suggest that he's anything other than pissed off, right?
Just pure
if you
anger.
read it,
Just
right?
anger.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's just upset,
Yeah.
right? He's just frustrated and angry, and he curses it. And now, this is not always a very popular interpretation among Christians who like to imagine that he's morally perfect and would never succumb to anger. But
Why is anger morally imperfect though?
He feels despair. Of course, he can have a moment of anger too, and I think that was probably much closer to the original meaning of that.
So-
But God got
temple.
But
angry.
the point is that story has never been used by or understood within Christianity as a model for how we ought to regard fig trees.
Yeah, that's why I'm confused.
No Christian has ever understood that
Right,
that pericope as meaning that.
I agree. That's not really the issue. That's kind of not the point I'm getting at. The point I was getting at is if you've got an immoral act or a moral act, cursing all fig trees, you don't see Christians acting on this act that Jesus did, but you do see Christians acting on other acts that Jesus did and treating them as if they're lost, such as selling things in the church. You could argue that that is also Jesus succumbing to anger and kicking and treating these people poorly and kicking them out of the church and treating them in a way that would not be conducive to what our morals dictate nowadays. But
Yeah.
you might still be like, okay, well, but we're still gonna kick them out of the church. We're just not gonna be as abrasive to them. But you've got one that you're treating one way, one that you're treating the other way. But if you're going to look at this one this way, why isn't this one treated the other way? And but besides that, you've just got a contradiction error there,
No,
where it's like, well, yeah, however you're going to interpret it is.
You really
is
don't like your
kind of
mic today.
not,
You're beating the hell out of it, Jesh.
not the sorry, it's not the
Poor
point.
Mike.
I
The
think
point
the
is
turning
that
of the, I think the
Sorry,
turning
go
of the table story in the temple that it isn't to be understood as this is how Christians ought to behave, that they ought to walk into churches and
Right. That's how I looked at
right.
it.
oh, so they're not
It's just
supposed to follow Jesus.
no, wait,
No,
let me
no, no,
finish.
no.
Let me
It-
finish.
it's
Let me
just-
finish. Right. This is supposed to be God Himself expressing outrage at what is being done in His house of worship. Right. I mean, this is not how a Christian is supposed to feel about it. You're not supposed to feel the outrage that God is supposed. Right. This is supposed to be God being offended by what's going on here.
Well, God was offended by the tree too.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah,
Good
that's
point.
right.
correct me if I'm wrong, though.
I'll back up Ozzy's point. That was an excellent point, Ozzy. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Ozzy, correct me if I'm wrong. It's not prescribing that you have a duty to say I have to be morally outraged because God is morally outraged.
Right. You can disapprove of it, but you're not supposed to follow the moral example of Jesus here because that's not supposed to be a moral example.
Yeah.
That's Jesus acting in his capacity as God,
To be
right?
just
As
to be
the
pissed
object
off.
of worship in that
I
temple.
think
Yeah.
I think I would have been impressed if Jesus had acted more like a clinical psychologist than an angry man.
Let me get some super chats out of the way real quick. Steven Steen has been around for a while. Steven, he says SJ's destroying these guys. Yeah,
Steve.
we love Steven Steen.
I
Okay,
love Steven.
he's always wrong. That's why we love him. He's our favorite troll, and a good troll. Helios 575, $10. In my opinion, a better reading of the fig tree would be that if you ever come across a tree while hungry and it has no fruit, you should destroy it regardless if it's your tree or not, because Jesus did that. Okay.
I mean, the thing is that these things can be interpreted in these literal ways if you're going to, because what I'm going off of is I'm going SJ was, not how it could be interpreted. Yes, you could interpret it that, oh, this was him acting in the capacity of God. Sure, you can interpret it that way, that's fine. But SJ used the reasoning that, well, Jesus kicked these people out of the church, therefore it can be interpreted that in the capacity that we were having the discussion in, maybe she could change her answer later or whatever, that's fine, that it's now law that it is not acceptable to sell things in a church. Well, by that, if you're going to follow along those lines, then Jesus cursing the fig tree, now it would be some divine law that you have to protest fig trees, or I
think you're
what
taking
Helios
things.
said?
You're taking things in such a sort of a dogmatic way. It makes it really frustrating from my end to try to. I mean, it's really hard to deal with what you're. I think that we have to look at if we read the New Testament and we look at the things that Jesus did and we try to figure out, well, what is the message he's trying to give us? I didn't say after he went into the temple that this is now a law, but I would say it's a pretty good practice for any church not to be selling things within their walls, because that's something that Jesus scorned.
Well,
You said that your reasoning was because God said so.
Yeah, this goes back to the whole
because God said so.
Exactly.
Because Jesus,
But
yeah,
SJ,
Jesus said something. Then
SJ,
yeah.
this goes back to
So
the whole.
if
Hang on one sec. This goes back to the whole thing that Ozzy was trying to explain, and that I was trying to explain, SJ. When we're trying to determine what is ethical and unethical, these theories, these competing theories, these mutually exclusive theories, are what we ourselves want to live our lives by, right? So as a deontologist for yourself that says, look, the highest of the greater goods is that you are obeying God's law. The obeying of God's law, to not sell something out of the church, is what is ethical. That is the moral thing to do. And the obeying of God makes it ethical, regardless of anything else, regardless of it's helping the poor, regardless of consequentialist or anything like that. The obeying God is what makes it a morally good act. Right?
Right. That's the meaning of morality.
Exactly.
That exhausts the meaning of it. Right? There's nothing left over.
I like focusing on ontology a little more than that. I'd rather focus on the existence. I mean, do we have objective morality is a big question. I think that's always interesting to discuss.
Well,
I
the
find it
ontology of
curious.
morality for a deontologist is that you have to have duties, right? So the idea is if you have duties and obligations, that is the ontology. Right. And then you can ask, okay, well, where do these duties and obligations come from? How do they arise? Right. And people have different theories. Yeah, you can have.
But that's more epistemology, isn't it? Though, wouldn't that be more?
What's that?
Wouldn't that be more epistemology of where they come from and how to access them?
No, because you're talking about the nature. What constitutes? If you're asking what constitutes an obligation, right? That's that's an ontological
Sure,
question.
sure. What constitute, but
So,
how do we access that information?
Well, I think we're
well,
going to run into a little
that's
bit of a
well, how
problem.
we find out, how we discover that, that's going to be moral epistemology.
Yeah,
How we
okay.
Yeah, that's
decide.
epistemology.
Yeah, that's
Well, what
right.
I'm trying to get to is the inconsistency is my issue. This is why it's probably for SJ to hear like or pick up what I'm trying to throw down. And it's essentially because what I'm saying is that if you're going to follow Jesus this way in this capacity, it's inconsistent for you not to do it in this capacity. So when given this example, what is your reasoning for it? Because your reasoning should be the same. That's why Steve's running into problems of being like, well, this is following the law and this is prescriptivist and this is you following a paragon. Right, that like it's an inconsistent issue.
Right. I
That's
agree
what I
with
was
that.
trying to point
I
out.
don't see it as being inconsistent at all. I think what we're doing is when I say I look at the Bible, I try to figure out what the meaning of the message is and what Jesus is trying to tell us to do. And then if I look at the example inside the church where Jesus was saying he doesn't want people, exchanging money inside the church, then I would take that to modern times and say it's not a good idea to be selling things inside the church. Jesus made that really clear.
But here's the okay. This is the key point, SJ, that I think that all of us are trying to explain. What makes it not moral to sell things in the church? What is the reasoning for that? What makes it immoral?
Because it's a slap in the face to God. You're supposed to be in the church praising and worshiping God. You're not supposed to be there changing money in a den of thieves.
But that's not what God's saying. To a deontologist, they would say it is immoral to sell things in the church because God has commanded us not to. That's it. That is what makes it morally immoral. That's it. That is as Ozzy puts it, exhaustive. Nothing else. Does that make sense?
No, there's nothing. It's not. The thing is I think you have to look at a wide variety of tools and mechanisms to figure out what you should do in these situations. I don't think there's, okay, I'm going to be a deontologist and nothing else.
For us,
it's
yes.
not like
for me,
that.
maybe, right? But to a deontologist that subscribes to
just
God
saying
as the
that
moral
I'm trying
lawgiver, I don't see how you could appeal to anything else other than that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I'm
hang on a
appealing
second.
to-
Okay, go ahead, Ozzy.
Could I just say something? So here's the difficulty. Yes, it's true. We all avail ourselves of different considerations, right? We take into consideration what we take to be our obligations and our duties. We take into consideration the predictable consequences of our actions upon other sentient beings. We all, we consider what it would say about our character if we were to do a certain thing, tell a certain lie, behave in a certain way, cheat on our taxes, whatever. Okay, all of these considerations intrude on our thinking when we are evaluating a course of action. Okay, but the terms that we're using here, deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, and so forth, they're supposed to explain the meaning of all of these. So if you are a consequentialist, you don't deny that you have obligations and duties. You just understand that obligations and duties are to be understood in terms of the consequences of your actions, right? So you're supposed to analyze, you're supposed to reduce or explain what obligations and duties you have in terms of consequences. If you're a deontologist, you wouldn't do that. You would say, no, that's completely wrong. Obligations and duties are not reduced to consequences. They might be reducible to something else. There might be something else that constitutes our obligations and duties. So if you're a divine command theorist, you would say, yeah, what constitutes our obligations and duties is whatever the hell God tells us to do.
Right.
Right. But the idea is that obligations and duties exhaust the meaning of morality if you're a deontologist. So yes, we do in fact use all of these types of considerations in our moral reasoning. But when you're trying to understand the ontology, which is what you said you were interested in, when you're trying to understand the ontology, you can't mix and match anymore because these are incompatible theories, right? So maybe you have in mind some other theory that is none of these, that takes into consideration and acknowledges that there are such things as consequences that matter, that intentions matter, that your character matters, that you genuinely have obligations and duties and stuff like that. I think all of those are true. I think those are real considerations, right? But I ground them in a theory. But what you can't do is say that you're talking the language of moral ontology when you mix and match this way, because now you are mixing and matching incompatible ontologies.
See, Ozzy, what I was saying, this is what I was saying. I was saying that they're actually different, that ontology is something separate, and that I was more interested in talking about whether or not objective morality existed, looking at ontology, rather than focusing on this deontology and utilitarianism. So that was my point earlier.
But now you're moving.
I wasn't trying to say that I was explaining deontology through ontology. That's not at all what I was saying.
Okay, no, but I'm not saying you're trying to explain deontology.
I was merely saying, I said, I just threw the word ontology out there before because I said, I would have rather, like in this whole conversation, we've been talking about normative ethical frameworks. I would have rather been talking about moral ontology and focusing on things such as, realism and relativism and that kind of thing.
Well, I get that, but this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, though, because I know you focus a lot on moral meta ethics, and I think normative ethics is far more interesting than meta ethics. Meta ethics is useless to me. I really don't care about some of these meta ethical theories. It just doesn't seem to me to have any kind of a value if they think morality is objective or subjective. I don't care. That doesn't tell me what they're going to do normatively. And I that's what I want to know, right? So I think normative ethics or applied ethics even are far more interesting a topic. But real quick, let me get some super chats real quick. Kawasa asks for 5,001. He says, if something is in the Bible needs to be translated and those meanings and translations can differ among people, is that really objective? Yes and no. I would say that if you have something that is objective that we can all look at, if that is the case, then that would be considered to be objective. I can look at the Bible, SJ can look at the Bible, we can interpret it differently, but at least we have something objectively to look at. But unfortunately, because of ethical subjectivism, this position that God has commanded these things for whatever reason that we don't know, right? Because again, no matter what you believe here, the problem is we don't know the mind of God, period. We don't. Even if God existed, there's no possible way I can see a connection. How are we going to know what God wants? We just assume that we've interpreted these things correctly. This is why even when God commands something, it is because he's commanded it subjectively, whether it be arbitrary or because there's some value higher than him. We don't know one way or another. And so objective to me just means that we can access something and you can access it and we all look at it and say, oh, look, this is the case. That's how I use objective in this terminology.
And Steve, just a heads up, we're at the 105.
Yeah, we're going to be wrapping it up soon. Lloyd asked for $2. YouTube Polish astronaut emits flat Earth 30s. I don't know what that means, but hey, flat Earth. Yeah, yay. But Ozzy, do you want to weigh in on that about why? I mean, what do you think about meta ethics over normative?
Well, it's funny when you were saying that, and I've heard you say that before, that you don't care much about meta ethics. Yeah. I take the opposite view. I'm actually more interested in the meta-ethical stuff than the normative theories, because just from the standpoint of trying to sort out what your own normative ethical position is, I don't think you can get as far as figuring out a normative ethical position until
you make a meta-ethical one?
Until you make some meta-ethical choices. That is, you have to have some understanding of what you think moral discourse is.
I agree with that. Yeah, right? Yeah. I'm not saying it's not an important.
You sort of have to sort out whether or not you're a realist or not. You have to sort out what you think the meaning of moral talk is.
Cognitive versus non-cognitive.
Yeah, exactly. And so once you've sorted that out, then you can sort of either consider the theories that are available within the meta-ethical framework that you find yourself in.
I totally agree with you that. I just find it to be a dull topic most of the time. Is that kind of because
it can be. I mean, it can be a little bit abstract, drawn. Right?
Yeah.
It can be a little abstract. But I mean, I think these are sort of the deepest questions. The meta-ethical questions, I think, are some of the deepest questions about morality. I mean, because very often when people are arguing about something like a trolley problem or any ethical dilemma, very often you can, if you know what a person's stance is on one ethical dilemma, and you can figure out, oh, they seem to be operating within the scope of consequentialism, or they seem to be a deontologist or something like that, then you can very often predict with a high degree of reliability what their position will be on a similar or even a dissimilar moral dilemma. And what's interesting is when you can find the inconsistencies, when you can say, well, wait a minute, on all of these cases over here, you come down on the side of deontology, but yet when I put you in this situation over here, I ask you to imagine this thought experiment, like a realistic dilemma of some sort, you come down on some other thing. Don't you see there's an inconsistency there? And so I think that things like trolley problems and all of this talk of meta ethics really helps you sort out and spot the inconsistencies in your moral thinking.
Yeah, no,
And
I
it's hard to do
agree with
at the
that.
moral
It's just
level.
the reason why I'm not interested in the meta is so much is that 90% of the time people talk past each other, and it doesn't really. They're not really formulating any kind of real framework. I mean, I've had people like legit, like I think it was Alex O'Connor. He messaged me one time, and he was emailing me, and he was talking about how he was getting in. He was a motivist, right? So he was some kind of moral non-cognitivist.
That's cosmic skeptic, by the way.
Yeah, cosmic skeptic. And so he was talking about being a motivist, but at the same time being a moral subjectivist, right? And so he had this competing thing between a cognitive theories versus non-cognitive, and he was appealing to both. And it was just kind of odd to me.
Yeah, and he's the guy who's the big ethical vegan, like, right?
Yeah, it was really weird. And I talked to
doesn't make a lot
Rational
of
Rules
sense.
about this, and because I wanted to make sure it wasn't just me, man. I was like, I talked to Rational Rules. I said, look, is Cosmic Skeptic like having two very competing different positions right now? And he was like, yeah. And I see this, and the reason I brought this up because I see the SJ doing the same thing with normative. No offense, SJ. I see you having very competing views and trying to just like be all over the place. That's what confusing.
Let me people are interpreting it as you're wanting to have your cake and eat it too.
Because using justifications.
Let me explain at least a little bit, at least take a second here, because one of the things that there's a few things that were said. One thing we're talking about, the idea, one of the complaints about the trolley theory in the literature, in the moral psychology, and Ozzy did identify most of the places where I did find this information, but one of the complaints about the trolley dilemma is it forces a dichotomy between utilitarianism and deontology, as far as people have to make one choice. It's either following a duty or they have to make a choice that's following the utilitarian choice. And the idea with that is what happens when people are put in real situations and they're drawing from a number of different ways to look at things, a number of different lenses to make their decisions. That's all I'm saying.
Well, yeah, I mean, like the trolley problem. Most people, like, the first thing that they're asked, do they flip the switch, right? Do they kill one person to save five? And most people would probably agree that would be the moral thing to do. Where I think the morality really goes into what your core beliefs are, is where you have to like push somebody in front of the train, the fat man, so to speak, and kill him in order to save the five people. Because now you have violated his rights, right? Now what is not just moving a lever. You're not violating anybody's rights by moving a lever, but you have violated that patient-centered virtue theory that saying, hey, look, every individual has a certain amount of inalienable rights. And by you pushing that guy, even though to save five, it is morally impermissible. Because a lot of people don't think that way. They think, look, I pull that switch, one person dies, versus five. That's consequentialism. If I push the fat man, consequentialism. One person dies to save the five. But to a virtue ethicist, based upon a patient-centered theory, no, it is impermissible to push that man, because now you are physically doing something to him rather than just pulling a lever. You're violating his inalienable rights. That's where the trolley problems get into a lot more complicated things. And this is what I think Ozzy was saying before. This is what you people are trying to suss out, is what is your grounding for the moral decision making. And if you say, well, God is my moral grounding for the decision making, when you have these real ethical considerations, I think it hobbles people in some way, because who the hell knows what God would do in these things, right? I mean, God, how would you use deontology for God's commandments to say, okay, what would I do? Do I push the guy or not push the guy? Because now you're appealing to virtue ethics. You're not appealing to deontology.
What if the fat man is Satan?
Well, there's the evil fat man thing too, right? There's so many different variations of these things, right?
I do think when somebody said the story of, okay, the Bible, we talk about the Bible, there's a Bible, we said, and then we say, well, what's the objective outcome, or what should we do objectively by looking to the Bible? Because people have all kinds of different interpretations of the Bible. But the way that I would look at that is, if I take a moral ontological perspective, or just an ontological perspective, I would say, okay, the Bible is there. It's on the table. It's objectively there. And there are some stories in there that are, you can read them, at face value. They exist. Okay, so that's the ontological. Now we look at the epistemological idea and we say, okay, well, now how did we come to believe in the Bible? Or how do we want to interpret the Bible? Or based on the fact that people have varying interpretations of the Bible, does that mean the Bible does not exist? No, the Bible still exists. It's like math exists. It doesn't matter whether or not someone understands math or people have different interpretations of math. Math itself always exists.
I don't think that's a fair comparison. And the reason being is because even though there's objectively the case to be had that the Bible's there, the information contained therein does not necessarily mean that it's objectively these are moral facts given by a deity.
But that's an epistemological question that you're saying. Trying to look at the meaning.
Well, yeah, I accept moral facts exist. I think there's arguments to be had for moral realism, as you know, right? I think that people, when I hear somebody dismiss moral realism out of hand by fiat because they've been ingrained not to accept moral realism, I don't think they understand the topic too well.
I think you're right.
We should look to wrap up.
Yeah, we're gonna be. We're almost at the 2 hour mark. I've been paying attention.
And
6 minutes.
Yeah, we're also we're getting suggestions in the chat to have SJ and Ozzy talk. And I think that would be a really fun non sequitur episode.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe more meta stuff of SJ and Ozzy maybe.
I'd like to talk about that
instead of normative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I don't disagree with that SJ much on her meta-ethical theories.
Yeah, and I don't think we disagree really on the other. It's just that I think we just have different views on it. And I can understand Ozzy's position on taking, we should focus on what the meaning is behind all of this stuff. So if we say, okay, this person made that decision, they were trying to follow their duties, the meaning, we're trying to dig into the meaning of deontology based on that.
Yeah. So. Well, I'm kind of disappointed we didn't get into, because maybe next time, but your argument.
Get caught up in jargon.
Yeah, well, I told Chesh earlier, I said one thing before we went on air, I was like, look, these discussions tend to be very jargon laden, and it sucks because it's just not an easy topic. Morality is one of the harder topics, I think, in philosophy. I think the only things that are harder for me personally, philosophy of mind is one of the hardest things for me to grasp. But moral talk is very confusing. But SJ had said that, her belief is that if moral facts exist, they are contingent upon a moral lawgiver, which is God. And so these metaethical theories, you cannot have objective morality without a deity. I find that to be wrong. I think you can have, obviously, objective morality that does not require any kind of deification whatsoever. But I think that would have been a different topic altogether, right? Yeah, that would have been fascinating. So we could do that next time where her and Ozzy can get in that topic, because I think Ozzy probably has a lot to add on that particular subject. If you, because Ozzy, I think you agree with me that
on second episode.
Yeah, Ozzy, would you agree that that it is possible to have objective morality that has no requirement to have a deity?
That has no requirement what?
To have a God.
Yeah, obviously, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I'm a moral realist and I'm an atheist, so clearly, I think that there are moral facts and they don't require a God.
Yeah, and I'm in the same position as you. I tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to have a conversation like that. I mean, I don't do debates or anything like that, but I'd be happy to sort of explore these ideas together.
Yeah, we're not going to do debates on non sequitur. We're not. I'm not big into the debate stuff, Ozzy. I like to have the discussions like this. They're open. They're free flowing. I find them to be more interesting to listen to, and they're not adversarial.
What will end up happening? I think what will end up happening. There'll probably still be wild debates on there.
Occasionally, yeah.
Look to do is we're gonna give SJ X amount of time, like 5-10, to say what their stance are, where they're coming from. Give you X amount of time to say where your stance is coming from. Now we can have a discussion, because we both now you can start deciding like, okay, well, I have this question about what your stance is, and I have this question about your stance, and kind of go more organically from there.
Yeah, well, I agree with that too, because last times we did these discussion with morality, for example, we had one, I can't remember who it was. I think it was Greg Geiler and somebody, maybe it was Holy Kool-Aid, but they were having a discussion on moral ontology, and they were completely talking about different terminology, and it went nowhere.
Well, yeah, that's why we have to get people to say from.
Yeah. So pick one or the other and go with it. But yeah, these terms are used differently in different theories. But anyways, we're going to wrap it up, guys. I want to keep it under 2 hours. Ozzy, thanks for dropping in. Josh, really good note taking. Appreciate it a lot. SJ, always a pleasure.
I was just trying to be a helper.
No, you did great. No, actually, I think your questions were brilliant, actually. And SJ,
thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to be on. I'm going to be on the Modern Day Debate on Sunday, debating Jim Majors on if Jesus resurrected.
Good luck with that.
I'm gonna be watching the hell out of that. That's gonna be.
You know what? I gotta tell you, I really hate the whole Jesus resurrection thing and the whole mythicism with his. But I like listening to Jim. Right? Jim at least makes it interesting. So.
Yeah, I like Jib. I'm just putting SJ's link in the chat. So if any of you guys want to go check out more of her stuff, that's her YouTube channel. Is there anything else you want to plug?
No, I want to say just thank you for having me on. We haven't talked in a long time. I haven't talked to you ever in person, and I haven't. I just shouldn't say in person, but I mean like this.
Yeah,
and I've talked to Steve a bunch of times, but it's been a long time. So thank you so much, and it was nice to talk to Ozzy too.
Yeah,
and
I hope I didn't come off too abrasive.
The other guy who was on here, John. Was it John? The other person who was in here,
Hal.
He seems like a nice guy too.
Yeah, he's cool. Yeah, we have cool people. We have cool people, man. You know, I want to surround myself with people that like talking about these topics and do so informatively and educational. Why to be entertaining, and I think that's what the Non Sequitur Show is going to be back when we're going to be following that kind of format, as well as this channel and on the Great Debate Community channel. The Discord here, I'm getting used to it. I did this kind of thing on the Great Debate Community channel the other day, so if you wanted to join that, the link is in the video description to join the Discord and also the Great Debate Community channel, which is the other channel out there. Go subscribe to that one too, because I'm going to be doing these Discord hangouts from that channel more often. But on main things like this, I'm going to give it a shot rather than using Hangouts or what's some of the other ones, Google Meets or something. People have said use Discord for this kind of stuff, and I gotta tell you, SJ, this actually worked out pretty well. I hate Discord, but I hate it a little less. Okay.
I think it worked out well.
Yeah, no, I liked it.
We have a couple of super chats that you didn't get. Helios57545 said, SJ, how do Bible teachings on and doesn't address with any of its laws? I think you would probably have to come up with an example for that. John Lloyd for 2 said, is anyone here breaking any of the 10 Commandments? And I think that was it.
I don't think the 10 Commandments are that helpful. I think most of them are archaic. And a lot of them are, egotistical with God, but
and they're not good enough.
Yeah, and maybe that should be a whole different show, but I don't really see how the 10 Commandments provide a very good moral framework. I just don't. But maybe we could go through them one by one and see how they apply to some kind of modernity and how they apply to form a whole ethical theory just upon 10 rules, But all right, guys, thanks for the super chats. Did you answer Helios' question? Or was that?
I couldn't. Jess was cutting
Yeah,
out.
she was breaking up. I know. And so I want to make sure the Helios question at least gets addressed before we log off. He says, SJ, how do you morally judge situations that the Bible has no teaching on and doesn't address with any of its laws? And I think that's a great question. I was going to ask that earlier, something similar to those. How do you make a moral decision if God hasn't weighed in on it?
I would try to, my basic thing is to look to 2 things. Look to the example of Jesus and also look to the 2 main laws that Jesus said. Love the Lord above all else and love your neighbors as yourself.
Yeah, I don't think that applies to so many different situations, but we'll say that for another time. Okay. Awesome. So thank you guys again for watching. Thank you for all your support, and we'll see you later.
And I'll plug real quick. Fight the Flat Earth is on.
Oh, you broke up again. Fight the Flat Earth is what?
Links in the chat.
Links in the chat. Fight the Flat Earth.
Links in the chat. Fight the Flat Earth is on with Red's Rhetoric and JM Truth.
Oh, God.
Again?
Really? JM Truth?
Yeah, again.
Oh, I can't. I just can't.
Run away. The sun's
Run away.
Scream at us.
No, go watch it because it got Reds in it. How bad could it be?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, that would be what's making it bad.
Oh, God. JM Truth. I'm done. Good night.
Night.